speaker for the opposition, but I do indicate the opposition's opposition to this bill. A short bill, and it's coming to the House in terms of necessary legislation to repeal moratorium that was applied first at the outset of the Marshall Liberal government back in early 2018, consequent on a long-standing election commitment prior to that election to do exactly that. And that in turn was off the back of a thoroughgoing and independent, productive parliamentary process by the Natural Resources Committee going back even a couple of years prior to that, which, and I'll get to them in a moment, had heard, I think, 170 odd submissions, thoroughgoing community consultation, and so on. And so, against the background of that, and in the context of that, we had a moratorium that was put in place fulfilling that election commitment early in 2018. And it's telling and appropriate and proper that the House has heard from the member for Mount Gambier, and in the clearest of terms, the most reasonable of terms just now, saying what we all know to be perfectly plain and true. That is, that there are serious considerations to be taken into account in the appropriate way should there be further reconsideration of this moratorium. But all the more so as well because in addition to the moratorium that was applied at the outset of the Marshall Liberal government, the member for Mount Gambier, the previous member, sponsored legislation into the House later that year to make sure that that moratorium was legislated. And he, in doing so, as the independent member, had the support of the then government in doing so. And so there's a parliamentary debate about the moratorium. So it occupied the bulk of that first year in different ways. So, one way or another, in the course of 2018, we saw the new government apply the moratorium, and whether or not it was regarded as necessary, belts and braces, it got legislated later in that year, the result of that process. And member for Mount Gambier wasn't the only one who'd brought legislation to the Parliament in that year. As I recall, the Honourable Mark Parnell, member of the Legislative Council, had done so in a similar way. So there were concerns to legislate what was that 10-year commitment. And I don't think that that was reflecting any doubts about the resolve of the government having met that election commitment, but there it was, and it was legislated. That's the reason why we're here, because all of this became the subject of the legislation. It found its way, therefore, into a new Division 1 capital A of Part 3 of the Energy Resources Act, and that applied in fairly short terms the moratorium as we're familiar with it. I won't stay on this for too terribly long, but it's important just to be very clear about this as well. Section 11 capital A describes the terms of the moratorium. It's headed Moratorium on Hydraulic Fracturing, and it provides, fairly briefly, that the Minister must not, during the prescribed period, that's the well-familiar period of the moratorium, the 10 years, grant a licence under this Act that authorises the carrying out of hydraulic fracturing within the designated area, and that's defined to be those several council areas with which we are concerned. 2, a condition of a licence that purports to authorise the carrying out of hydraulic fracturing will be taken to be void and have no effect, and those provisions are said to apply before or after the commencement of the section, and there's an exclusion of compensation. Now, relevantly here, we're concerned with the substance of all of that, which is subsections 1 too. Now, you hear nothing in any of that that says that it's not possible to talk about the subject matter at any time along the way. What you've got is a moratorium against the issue of a licence by the Minister during that period of time. It's important to be clear about this. The Minister's made his second reading contribution. That was incorporated in the Hansard with leave yesterday, and I'll refer to it in a moment. And that gives us an indication of what has been learned before, during and after that time, but it also flags what is perfectly possible to do in the context of the moratorium. The Minister said in remarks that were incorporated at Hansard that words by way of reassurance. He said that no activity is permitted under the Energy Resources Act until assessment and consultation processes are followed to demonstrate how significant risks will be avoided and how community concerns will be effectively managed. All of that's true, and that's good reassurance. But there's nothing to prevent, of course, any of that activity, any of that consultation happening in the context, in an orderly way, of what we've got presently, which is simply the inability for a licence to be issued. Now, this is all obvious, plainly obvious, of course. But we had on Tuesday this week, in the question time, the Premier telling the House that part of the rationale for rushing to bring an end to this moratorium 2 years early was, and I'll quote him. He said in response to a question from the Leader of the Opposition, which was, did the Premier consult with anyone in relation to his decision to end the moratorium on fracking in the southeast, and if so, who and when? The Premier said, we are legislatively prohibited from doing that consultation. If we lift the moratorium, then it enables the regulator, in conjunction with proponents, to go down to the southeast and engage in more consultation than you could possibly imagine. It actually enables the consultation to occur because you can't start fracture stimulation unless you demonstrate appropriate scientific governance. So yeah, of course you can't start the fracture stimulation until you've done all the necessaries. It's all totally familiar. Of course that's true. And especially you can't do that unless you demonstrate the appropriate scientific governance. All that's true. But the first part of the answer about this sort of legislative prohibition on consultation is just not there at all. And again, it couldn't be more straightforward. Now, let's compare what occurred in the lead up to 2018, and I've flagged it at the outset of my remarks. But let's take it back.
Order.
Let's take it back even further. Let's take it back even further. We've got at the moment a very significant moment in our state, and it's all happening. At once, as it were, by coincidence. We're at a point of significance in the state in terms of the renewal and amendment and future planning of the indenture at Olympic Dam, the vital and crucial work that's been now undertaken for decades by BHP and to be carried on forward. And the government's been celebrating the great work that's going on there in the course of this week, and as well it should, and as well we should. I think there was very specific celebration of the receipt of the biggest cheque that's been received by the government so far in what's been an extraordinary history of work that's gone on at Olympic Dam, the result of the indenture, and that's work that's in the renewal. By way of example, because we know we've had occasion in the Parliament to reflect on this in numerous ways, including just last August on the passing of Roger Goldsworthy, about what occurred in the getting that done in the first place. Now, I referred at the outside of my remarks to what had led up to the implementation of the present moratorium, the subject of the legislation. As is well documented and as found its way into the debate on that occasion, and I recognise that the Minister, the Member for West Torrens, has made very clear his view about the then Labor government and then Labor opposition once Tonkin won in '79, got it wrong at all stages then. Got it wrong at all stages then. And that what we have now is the 40-plus year legacy of that great decision. Now, the point for present purposes, it's a good example indeed, because, and there's been some desire on the government side to sort of draw these comparisons. In that case, of course, the celebrated display of courage and resolve led by Roger Goldsworthy and the Tonkin government was characterised by a commitment that it took to the 1979 election and the staying of the course in prosecuting policy that was going to reinforce investments of the tens of millions already committed by the commencement, that ensured that could happen. All taken to an election. None of us saw the mandate. You didn't see the mandate. All taken to an election, and all prosecuted then by a new government. Contrast that with what we've got now before us, and let's be really clear. Let's be really clear. What we've seen on display in the last sort of week and a half, we can sort of count the days. What we've seen on display in the last sort of several days is Malinauskas Labor, and there's a conference of some significance going on in town, and there's a new Parliament, new session, new members elected, a new dynamic and all the rest of it. Malinauskas Labor, despite having said not a word about this, there was no need to. We had a moratorium in place going into 2028. And having said not a word about this, I mean, for better or worse, to the constituents of the member for Mount Gambier or to anybody else, and having said not a word to any of them, having said not a word to anybody, I mean, you're sort of left having to sort of think to yourself, hang on, was this something they sort of kept up their sleeve, much like, Prime Minister Albanese, who sort of said, no, we're never going to do any of this kind of capital gains tax and needed gearing change. No, we'll never do that, I think, over and over again, and then does precisely the opposite within a year of coming to government. The Malinauskas Labor seems to have, and I'm reading the play here, seems to have sort of decided, okay, we've sort of kept this in the back pocket in the lead up to the election. We could have gone down to Mount Gambier and said, hey, guess what? Your big chance to vote in a Labor member now is in order to ensure that we've got a mandate to get on with a complete change of tack. Huh? Because what they could have then done is they could have said honestly, and we've been hearing some sort of indication from the minister about how much
I don't need your help.
about how much support
He's pointing at him.
Labor received in the district of Mount Gambier. Now, you know, you just sort of wonder, well, hang on. If they were sort of so certain that that was going to be a real boost for them in Mount Gambier, they might have come along and said, guess what, this is what we're going to do. You know, like Roger Goldsworthy did. You know, maybe they would have gone along and said, hey, everyone in Mount Gambier, we really want to have a mandate because we've got a plan for what's going to be a change of tack. We all know that we've been under this moratorium. We know that we've been under this moratorium for this whole period of time. And guess what? What we're going to do is, first chance we get, you know, if we're fortunate to be re-elected, we're going to change tack. Now,
Order.
So I suspect that what's rather occurred is that Malinauskas Labor's not going to tell anyone in Mount Gambier ahead of the election because they know that people will abandon them in droves. And moreover, they don't actually have that plan. I'm not suggesting they're sort of quite so sinister, but afterwards, it's terribly convenient to be able to come along at no notice and sort of, you know, put the new membership of the parliament somehow to some sort of instantaneous test, you know, and say, guess what? Agree with all of us immediately. Agree with us immediately, you know, or we'll go along and take cheap shots about members of the parliament, including to those who are visiting and participating, you know, at a significant conference. You know, that's what we'll do.
Order.
That's what we'll do.
Minister for Energy and Mining. Member for Dunstan, please take your seat. Member for Hyson, please just take your seat. Okay, we'll stop the clock, that's fine. We're nearly there. There's a lot of squabbling happening across the chamber. It's not necessary. Let the member finish his speech, and in committee it can be questioned. Continue.
Thanks, Speaker. And I sort of ask for a bit of an extra half a gold star because I've not been responding. I've not been goaded. I've not been responding. I've been just pressing on. But I appreciate very much. I appreciate very much your intervention, Speaker. So what's, you know, look, in my
Minister, that's a warning.
In my, you know, in my you know, rather bumbling kind of way, perhaps, I hope, you know, any deficiencies in, you know, in the clarity of my speech, I hope might be forgiven. The key point here, of course, is just how wafer thin and politically opportunistic Malinauskas Labor has been over the course of these recent days on a topic that is of such moment for our state. And, you know, the minister talks out of one side of his mouth to one audience about how, you know, hugely important having certainty and security for investment and how important the contribution of mining is to this state. All undoubtedly true propositions, no doubt about it at all. But then turns around and plays this kind of wafer-thin politics around some expectation that unless everybody sort of jumps to his latest sort of thought bubble politically, then somehow we're the irresponsible ones. Well, Minister, let me take you back to, and Speaker, you too, to 2016 and the Natural Resources Committee report that provided the example of what you ought to be doing, and all the more so in government. If you want to go ahead and bring to an end a moratorium that's been there, perfectly able to be seen, navigated, negotiated, consulted upon, you want to bring it to an end, you know, precipitously, you know, then there's nothing preventing you from doing any of the above. Your own consultation, your own visit and test, your own committee report that you could have, you know, gone ahead and instituted. And I'm sure you would have had willing participants in that whole process. Yeah, let's see if the world has changed. You know, instead, what we've seen, and you know, the minister's on the record. He said as recently as 2025. I think 21st of June, and this might be a good way to finish. The minister on 21 June 2025, in terms of a legislated ban, we'll deal with it when it comes to an end. And we've heard nothing else since.